Let yourself settle now. Find the place where your body meets the surface beneath it. The gentle pressure of your shoulders against the chair or the bed, the quiet weight of your hands resting at your sides, the slow and steady presence of the ground holding you up. You do not need to move. You do not need to change anything. You are already where you need to be. Feel the air as it moves around you, cool against your skin, touching your face, your arms, the back of your hands. Notice how it moves as you breathe in and how it moves again as you breathe out. There is no need to control it. Just let the breath come and go. The way water finds its own level. The way the tide returns to the shore without effort. Bring your attention now to your feet, resting quietly, heavy and still. Let that heaviness travel slowly upward to your ankles, your calves, your knees, a gentle release, like warmth spreading through sand. Let your legs sink deeper into the surface beneath you. Feel your hips settle, your lower back soften, your spine lengthen without trying. The weight of your shoulders drops, your jaw loosens. The space between your eyebrows grows smooth and wide. And now, in the quiet that is settling around you, let an image form in your mind. See yourself sitting on warm grass, your back against an old stone wall that still holds the heat of the afternoon sun. Before you, a garden stretches into soft golden light. Not a garden in full bloom, but one that is resting, waiting, patient beneath a pale sky. The grass beneath your hands is dry and soft. The air is still. There is a book open in your lap, but you have not been reading it. You have been sitting here without needing anything, and the quiet has been building around you like light fading into evening. And somewhere in the distance, you begin to hear it, the sound of wind moving across a wide and open land, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and green things growing. It is not a sound that demands anything of you. It is simply there, like the breath moving through your body, like the slow rhythm of your heart, like the story that has been waiting for you all along. Let that sound carry you now, gently, into a quiet and distant house where a small girl sits at a window watching the gray light fade, listening to the wind as it speaks across the moors. The first thing Mary Lennox noticed was the silence. It was not the silence of an empty house. She had known that before in India, when the servants had fled and the bungalow had grown still, and the ceiling fan had turned slowly above her without anyone to watch it. That silence had been thick and waiting, the silence of something about to happen. This was different. This silence had weight, a deep and ancient quiet that seemed to come from the stones themselves, from the heavy oak beams above her head, from the long corridors that stretched away into shadow on every side. She stood at her window, looking out onto nothing but gray. Gray sky, gray land, gray light with no source and no direction. The house was called Misselthwaite Manor, a vast place of nearly 100 rooms, most of them locked, their furniture draped in white cloth like figures waiting to be remembered. Outside, the wind moved across the moor in long, slow breaths, a sound so constant that after the first hour she stopped noticing it, the way one stops noticing one's own breathing. But it was there, a low, steady hum. Mrs. Medlock, the housekeeper, had brought her here, a tall woman in black who spoke in short sentences, as if words were something to be measured carefully and not wasted. She had met Mary at the station in the evening, when the light had already begun to fade, and they had driven for hours across the darkening moor in a carriage that smelled of old leather and damp wool. Mary watched the landscape through the window, a vast emptiness of heather and grass and stone walls winding across the hills like veins, and felt nothing. Not fear, not sadness, not curiosity. Just the same hollow absence that had been with her since she had woken in the empty bungalow and known, without anyone telling her, that she was alone in the world. The manor, when it finally appeared, was larger than she had imagined, a dark mass against the dark sky, its windows catching the last gray light like half-closed eyes. Mrs. Medlock had led her through a great hall past a fireplace big enough to stand in, up a staircase that turned twice along a corridor where the floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and finally to this room. With its tall bed and its cold hearth and its window looking out onto nothing but the moors. "Your meals will be brought to you," Mrs. Medlock had said. "Do not wander the house. There are areas that are not safe." And then she had left, her footsteps fading down the corridor, and the silence had settled around Mary like a blanket. That first evening, she had sat on the edge of the bed and watched the light change slowly beyond the window, the gray deepening to charcoal, the charcoal to a blue so dark it was nearly black. And then nothing but her own reflection in the glass, a thin girl with sharp features and dark hair staring back at herself from the darkness. She had not eaten the food that had been left for her. She had not lit the fire. She had simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the wind as it pushed against the window, listening to the old house settle and groan around her, listening to the vast and breathing quiet of a place that seemed to have forgotten it was meant to hold people at all. Later, much later, when the night had fully settled and the only light in the room came from the dying embers of a fire she did not remember lighting, Mary heard something that was not the wind. It was a sound from somewhere deep in the house, muffled, distant, but unmistakable. A crying. Not the cry of an animal or the creak of old timbers settling, but the sound of a child somewhere below or beside her, weeping in the dark. She sat up, her heart beating faster. The crying came again, fainter this time, as if whoever made it was trying to stop. And then it stopped, and there was only the wind again, the constant wind, and the slow creak of the old house around her. Mary lay back and stared at the ceiling, where the shadows from the embers moved slowly, like water. She did not call out. She did not go to the door. She lay still, her hands at her sides, and listened to the silence that had returned, knowing now that it was not empty. There was someone else in this house, someone who cried in the dark. The fire settled in the grate, the wind breathed across the moors, and Mary Lennox, who had not cried once since she had been found alone in the bungalow, lay in the great bed of Misselthwaite Manor and felt for the first time in days something that was not quite curiosity and not quite comfort, but something between the two, a small and fragile thread of connection reaching out through the dark towards a voice she had not yet met. The rain began, soft and distant, tapping against the glass like the lightest of fingers. She listened to it as she drifted, the sound of the wind and the rain and the old house settling around her, and somewhere in the space between waking and sleep, she thought she heard the crying again, softer now, as if it were already becoming part of the dream that was gathering around her. The sound of the wind crossing the moors carried her down into the first quiet of sleep, and in her dreams she was already walking through a garden green and golden, where a robin watched from a low branch, and a key lay waiting in the dark earth. Mary woke to light she did not recognize, not the sharp white light of India, nor the heavy darkness of her first night at Misselthwaite, but something in between, a pale gray gold that filled the room like water slowly rising. The rain had stopped. The crying had not come again. And the wind, which had been the only constant through the night, had softened to a murmur, as if it too was waking slowly. A girl stood at the foot of the bed, holding a tray. She was not Mrs. Medlock. She was younger, perhaps 16, with a round, rosy face and brown hair that escaped from her cap in soft curls. She wore a blue apron over her dress, and she smiled when she saw Mary's eyes open. "Eh, so you're awake then," she said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "I'm Martha. I'm to look after you. I've brought your breakfast, porridge, and a bit of bread and butter. Mrs. Medlock says you didn't eat a thing last night, and you must be hungry." Mary sat up slowly, the heavy quilt slipping from her shoulders. She looked at the tray, the steam rising from the porridge, the butter melting into the warm bread, and felt, for the first time in days, a small stirring of something that might have been appetite. She took a bite. The bread was dense and warm, the butter rich on her tongue, and she realized she was, in fact, very hungry. "Where does the rest of the house go?" Mary asked, because the question had been pressing at her since she arrived, and Martha seemed the kind of person one could ask without needing to be careful. Martha laughed, a soft, easy sound that seemed to brighten the gray room. "Oh, there's 100 rooms or more, they say." Most of them shut up. Mr. Craven's orders. He doesn't like anyone in them. Why? Martha hesitated, busying herself with the tray. "Well, it's not my place to say, miss, but there's a garden, you see. One of the walled gardens near the orchard. It belonged to Mrs. Craven before she passed. She tended it herself, every day, and when she died, Mr. Craven locked the door and buried the key, and no one's been inside in 10 years. He won't let anyone speak of it." Mary felt something shift in her chest. Not quite excitement, that would have been too sharp, too bright for the heavy gray of the morning, but a quiet opening, like the first crack in soil before something green emerges. "I should like to see it," she said. "You can't," said Martha, but gently. "It's locked. No one can get in." Mary ate her breakfast in silence. The porridge warm and thick, the bread soft and satisfying. The thought of the locked garden stayed with her, a small, warm presence at the edge of her mind. She found herself glancing toward the window, toward the gray light beyond, where somewhere in the grounds a door was hidden, a key was buried, and a garden was waiting. After breakfast, Martha helped her into clothes that had been left for her, a wool dress too large at the shoulders, sturdy brown boots with laces that Mary had to tie twice before they held, and then opened the door that led to the corridor. "You can go out into the gardens if you like," Martha said. "They're safe enough. Just don't go beyond the walls and don't wander onto the moor alone. It's a wild place if you don't know it." Mary walked down the long corridor, the floorboards creaking beneath her new boots, and found a side door that opened onto the grounds. She pushed it open and stepped outside, and the air hit her first, cold and clean, and so different from the stale warmth of the house that she stopped and stood still, breathing it in. The sky was wide and pale, the color of old linen, and the land stretched away from her in soft, rolling waves of brown and green, dotted with gray stone walls and bare trees whose branches reached upward like fingers. The wind moved across it in visible patterns, cloud shadows drifting over the grass, and Mary felt for the first time in her life that she was standing at the edge of something vast and ancient and indifferent, and that it did not mind her being there. She began to walk. The formal gardens near the house were tidy but lifeless, their hedges trimmed and their flower beds bare. Mary passed them without interest. It was the wall at the far edge of the grounds that drew her, a high stone wall, its surface covered in a thick blanket of ivy that moved slowly in the wind. Green leaves shifting against gray stone like the surface of a sea, she walked along its length, her gloved hand brushing the leaves, feeling the cold, rough stone beneath. There was something here, she could feel it. She was running her fingers along a particularly dense patch of ivy when she heard a sound, a small, bright trill, clear and lovely, unlike anything she had heard since leaving India. She turned. A robin sat on the low branch of a nearby tree, its breast a flash of vivid red against the gray air, its black eye fixed on her with what seemed like deliberate attention. It hopped once, twice, then flew to a lower branch. Closer, it tilted its head regarding her and then dropped to the ground and pecked at the earth near the base of the wall. Mary walked closer. The robin hopped a few feet, pecked again, and then flew to a spot where the soil looked darker, freshly disturbed. It perched on a low stone and sang a brief liquid sequence of notes that seemed to say, "Here. Look here." She knelt, the damp cold seeping through the wool of her stockings, and began to dig with her hands. The earth was soft and rich, dark against her pale fingers. It crumbled easily, and she felt the texture of it, cool, slightly grainy, smelling of damp and old leaves. Her fingers found something hard buried just beneath the surface, a shape worn smooth by years in the soil. She worked it free and sat back on her heels. A key, old iron, rusted in places, its handle curled into an ornate loop. It lay in her palm, heavier than she had expected, and warm from the earth that had held it. She looked at the robin, which had returned to its branch and was watching her with its bright, unblinking eye. The world around her seemed to hold its breath. The wind paused, the leaves stilled, and for a long moment there was only Mary and the robin and the key, heavy and real, in her hand. "Thank you," she whispered, and the robin sang once, briefly, before flying away across the garden. Mary stood, brushing the dirt from her dress. She looked at the wall, at the thick ivy covering its surface. She began to walk along it again, slowly this time, her hand trailing over the leaves, pressing against the stone beneath, and near the far end, where the wall curved slightly and the ivy grew thickest, her fingers found something different, not rough stone but wood, smooth and solid beneath the green. A door. She pulled at the ivy, revealing its edge. It was heavy, old, its surface weathered by years of rain and wind. She pressed her palm flat against it and felt the cold grain of the wood, the small gap where it met the frame. She reached into her pocket and touched the key. She could open it. She could turn the key and push the door open and see what lay beyond. But she did not. Not yet. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock began to strike the hour. The sound drifted across the gardens, low and resonant, and Mary let her hand fall from the door. She looked up at the wall, at the ivy that had hidden this door for 10 years, and she understood that the garden had waited this long. It could wait a little longer. She turned and walked back toward the house, the key heavy in her pocket, the robin's song still echoing in her memory. Behind her, the ivy settled back into place, covering the door once more. But Mary knew where it was now. She knew where the key was, and she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that the garden had been waiting for her all along. The next morning, Mary woke before the sun had fully risen, the gray light just beginning to shape itself into something pale and soft beyond the window. She dressed quickly, her fingers working the buttons of the wool dress without needing to think about them, and slipped the key into her pocket. It was still there, cold against her thigh, solid and real. She did not eat breakfast. She did not stop to speak to Martha, who was already busy in the kitchen, the warm smell of baking bread drifting through the house. She walked through the corridors with a purpose she had never felt before, her boots echoing on the old stone floors, and pushed open the side door that led to the grounds. The air was cold and still, carrying the clean scent of dew on grass and the distant, earthy smell of the moors. The sky was a pale, clear blue, the clouds scattered and thin, and the first rays of sunlight were touching the tops of the bare trees, turning them gold at their edges. Mary walked quickly, her breath forming small clouds in front of her until she reached the wall. The ivy was wet with dew, each leaf tipped with a bead of water that caught the light like tiny glass spheres. She brushed her hand across it, feeling the cold, slick surface of the leaves, the roughness of the stone beneath. She found the door by memory, her fingers tracing the outline of the wood through the green, and then she stopped. She took the key from her pocket. It was warm now, warmed by her body, and it fit into the lock as if it had been waiting for her hand. She turned it. The lock gave with a soft, deep click, a sound that seemed to travel through the stone itself, through the earth beneath her feet, through the years of silence that had settled over this place. She pushed the door and it swung open slowly, the old hinges groaning, the ivy pulling away from the frame in long, reluctant strands. And then she stepped inside. The garden was a ruin. That was the first thing she understood, not with her eyes, but with her whole body. The air that met her was cool and damp and rich, thick with the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves and something green, something living beneath the decay. The walls rose high on every side, covered in ivy so dense that the light that reached the ground was soft and green, as if she were standing at the bottom of a deep pool. The stone paths were broken and overgrown, choked with weeds and moss. The fountain at the center was dry, its basin filled with dead leaves and rainwater. Rose branches twisted in every direction, their thorns long and sharp, reaching out like hands. But beneath it all, beneath the neglect and the wildness and the long years of abandonment, she could feel it, the garden waiting. She knelt and touched the earth. It was cold and damp, the texture of it soft and crumbly between her fingers, rich with the smell of compost and growth. She lifted a handful and let it fall through her fingers, watching the dark soil scatter against the gray stone. She had never touched earth like this before, not the dry, dusty soil of India, but this dark, living thing full of moisture and life and the promise of things that wanted to grow. She began to pull at the weeds. At first, it was aimless, her hands moving without direction, but soon she found a rhythm. The cool earth beneath her knees, the sharp tug as a weed gave way, the smell of disturbed soil rising around her. The sun moved slowly across the sky, its warmth touching her shoulders, and she worked without stopping, without thinking, her hands growing red and raw but not caring. The robin came and perched on the wall above her, watching, and every so often it sang a single clear note as if encouraging her. She did not know how long she had been working when she heard footsteps on the path outside. She froze, her hands still in the earth, and listened. The footfalls were light and steady, unhurried, accompanied by a soft, low whistling. A boy appeared in the gap where the door stood open, and he stopped when she saw him. He was perhaps 12, with a face as brown and weathered as the moor itself, and bright blue eyes that held no surprise, only a calm, steady attention, the same attention the robin had given her the day before. He wore a worn jacket and carried a small spade over his shoulder, and from his pocket peeked the head of a sleeping field mouse. "Well," he said, his voice soft and slow, the words shaped by the Yorkshire hills, "so you found it then, the garden." "You know about it?" Mary asked. "Everyone knows about it," he said, stepping inside. He looked around slowly, taking in the ruin, the weeds, the wild tangle of roses, but no one comes here, no one but you, it seems. "I'm Mary," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm Dickon, Martha's brother. She told me about you." He knelt beside her and touched the earth the way she had, letting it run through his fingers. "Good soil," he said. "Rich. It's been waiting for someone to wake it." He began to work beside her, his hands moving with a quiet competence that made her own efforts feel clumsy. He showed her which weeds to pull and which to leave, how to clear the dead growth from the rose branches without cutting the living wood, how to feel for the new buds hidden beneath the bark. His hands were rough and calloused the hands of someone who had spent his life working with the earth, and as he worked he talked, not to her exactly, but to the garden itself. Soft words of encouragement in his slow Yorkshire voice. "Come on then," he murmured to a twisted rose branch. "You've been sleeping long enough. Time to wake up." The smell of damp earth rose around them, warm and living, and the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the garden floor. Mary felt something she had never felt before, not quite happiness, but a deep, quiet satisfaction, the feeling of her body being useful, of her hands making something right. She looked at the patch of ground they had cleared, the dark soil exposed to the sun, and she thought she saw, in the corner of her eye, the faintest tip of something green pushing through. "You see?" Dickon said, following her gaze. "She's waking up." Later, when the sun had begun to slant toward afternoon and the shadows had grown long and cool, Mary walked back toward the house with dirt beneath her fingernails and the smell of earth in her hair. The key was still in her pocket, but it felt different now. Not the key to a mystery, but the key to something she was already beginning to call her own. As she entered the house, she heard it again, the crying. Faint, muffled, coming from somewhere above her. She stopped at the foot of the staircase and listened. It was the same sound she had heard her first night, the sound of a child weeping in the dark. She did not call out. She did not ask anyone. But she began to climb the stairs, her hand trailing along the cold wooden banister, following the sound up into the shadows of the upper floors, where the corridors were darker and the air smelled of dust and old linen and something else, something like longing waiting to be found. The crying led her to a door at the end of a long, narrow corridor. She stood before it, her hand resting on the cold brass handle, and listened to the sound on the other side, soft now, barely a whisper, the breathing of someone who had cried themselves to exhaustion. She opened the door. The room was dark, heavy curtains blocking the light, a fire burning low in the grate. On the bed, propped against a mountain of white pillows, was a boy about her age with pale skin and dark eyes too large for his face, and a look of such profound loneliness that Mary felt it in her chest like a physical weight. He stared at her. She stared back. "You're not a dream," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," she said, "I'm not." And she stepped inside, closing the door behind her, the smell of wood smoke and old books settling around her like a blanket, the key still warm in her pocket, the garden still blooming in her memory, and a new door opening somewhere deep in the quiet of her heart. Spring came slowly to the garden. It did not arrive all at once. It crept in day by day, a little more green each morning, a little more warmth in the afternoon air. Mary stood at the edge of the cleared path and watched the light change. The sun was warm on her shoulders, soft and constant, the kind of warmth that did not demand anything. It simply rested there. She touched the bark of the old tree near the fountain. It was rough and warm, the surface of it holding the heat of the afternoon. She pressed her palm flat against it and felt the life beneath, slow, patient, steady. The garden smelled of damp earth and fresh green, not the sharp, cold smell of early spring anymore, but something richer, deeper. The soil had been turned and watered, and the smell of it rising was warm and good. She knelt and touched a new leaf. It was soft and small, still curled at the edges, pale green and tender. She ran her finger along its surface and felt the delicate texture of it, the way it yielded to the lightest pressure. The robin came and landed on the wall above her. It tilted its head and watched her with its bright black eye, then hopped down to the earth a few feet away. It did not seem afraid. It seemed to know her now. Mary smiled. It was a small thing. That smile, but it was real. She thought of Colin. She had been to see him every day since that first night. He was always in the dark room, always in the bed, always pale and thin and watching her with those two large eyes. She had told him about the garden. She had described the green shoots and the warm earth and the robin. She had watched his face change as she spoke, the tight lines around his mouth softening, his breathing slowing. But she had not told him everything. She had not told him that the garden was real, that she had been inside it, that she had touched the earth and felt the sun on her face. She had not told him because she did not know how. The garden was hers. It had been a secret for so long, 10 years, longer than she had been alive, and she had found it. She had turned the key. She had walked through the door. But the garden was not hers to keep. That was the thought that came to her now, standing in the warm afternoon light, the robin hopping at her feet. The garden was not a secret to be guarded. It was a thing to be shared. The understanding settled over her like a blanket. Quiet. Warm. Right. She walked back to the house through the long shadows of late afternoon, her feet finding the path without needing to look. The air was soft and still, the last warmth of the sun on her skin. The first cool of evening beginning to gather in the hollows. She found Martha in the kitchen, rolling dough on the wooden table. The room was warm and smelled of flour and yeast and wood smoke. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the copper pots caught the light and glowed. "The garden," Mary said. "I need to bring Colin to the garden." Martha looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that needed no words. "Tomorrow," Mary said, "in the afternoon, when it is warmest." She went to Colin's room. The curtains were still drawn, the fire burning low, the air thick and still. Colin was propped against his pillows, his face turned toward the door as if he had been waiting for her. "You look different," he said. "I have been in the garden," she said. She sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand. It was thin and pale, the bones visible beneath the skin, but it was warm. "Tomorrow," she said, "I am going to take you there." His eyes widened. "Outside?" "Yes." "The garden? The one you told me about?" "Yes." He did not speak for a long moment. His hand tightened around hers, and she felt the slight tremor in his fingers. "I have not been outside in years," he whispered. "I know," she said. She stayed with him until the fire burned low and the shadows in the room grew deep and soft. She did not talk much. She simply sat, her hand in his, listening to the crackle of the embers and the slow, steady sound of his breathing. The next afternoon, the sun was warm and golden, the air soft with the sweetness of growing things. Martha and Dickon carried Colin out of the house on a chair, through the corridors and the side door, and across the grounds to the wall where the ivy grew thick and green. Mary walked ahead. She opened the door. Colin saw the garden for the first time. He did not speak. He simply looked at the green shoots pushing through the dark soil, at the buds forming on the rose branches, at the light falling soft and golden through the leaves. The robin perched on the fountain's edge and sang a single, clear note. The air was warm and still. The smell of earth and green things rose around them. The sun rested on Colin's face, and Mary watched the color begin to return to his cheeks. "It is real," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought you dreamed it. I thought I dreamed it." "It is real," Mary said. "It was always real." It was just waiting. Colin looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that had not been there before. Not hope. It was quieter than hope. It was the first stirring of belief, the sense that maybe for the first time in years, things could be different. "It is warm," he said. I did not remember what warm felt like. "The sun," Mary said. "It stays warm for a long time now. Spring is here." Dickon brought a cushion and placed it on the grass, and they helped Colin sit. He did not walk, not yet, but he sat, and he breathed, and he let the warmth of the sun and the smell of the earth and the sound of the birds wash over him. Mary sat beside him. She did not speak. She simply rested in the warmth of the afternoon, the smell of green things rising around her, the robin hopping nearby, and the quiet understanding that what had begun would continue. The garden was waking. Colin was waking. And she was no longer alone. The shadows lengthened. The air cooled. Dickon came and lifted Colin back into the chair, and they carried him back through the door, through the grounds, through the corridors of the old manor, but something had changed, something had opened. That night, Mary lay in her bed and looked at the ceiling. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was filled with the soft, warm dark of a spring evening. The window was open a crack, and she could smell the damp earth and the green growing things and the distant, clean scent of the moors. She did not think about India. She did not think about the bungalow or the cholera or the long, empty days before the ship. She thought about the garden, about Colin's face when he first saw the light, about the warmth of the sun on his skin. She thought about the way the robin had sung, a single note that seemed to hold everything. And she felt, for the first time in her life, a sense of peace so deep and quiet that it felt like floating, like lying on warm earth and watching clouds move across a vast sky, like being held by something larger than herself. She closed her eyes. The garden waited. The morning would come. But for now, there was only this, the warmth of the bed, the smell of spring through the window, the sound of her own slow breathing, and the knowledge that she had done something right. She slept. The garden was green. Everywhere Mary looked, there was green, soft and deep and bright, the green of new leaves and thick grass and climbing vines heavy with buds. The roses had begun to open, their petals pale pink and cream. The air was still and warm. The sun was golden, the light of late spring. Colin sat on the grass, his back against the old tree, his face turned up to the sun. His eyes were closed, his breathing was slow. Mary sat beside him. She did not speak. The robin perched on the fountain's edge. It sang once, a single clear note, and then it was quiet. Colin opened his eyes and looked at the garden, at the green, at the light, at the roses. Then he looked at his own hands. "I want to stand," he said. "Are you sure?" Mary asked. "Yes." Dickon held out his hand. Colin took it. He stood. His legs trembled. His breath caught. But he did not fall. He stood, his hand gripping Dickon's, his feet on the grass. He took a step, then another. The sun was warm on his face. The grass was soft beneath his feet. Colin walked to the rose bush and touched a flower. His fingers were gentle, barely brushing the petals. "It is real," he said. "All of it." "It always was," Mary said. "You just could not see it." He smiled. A small smile, barely a change in his face, but real. They sat together as the afternoon moved toward evening. The light shifted from gold to amber, the shadows growing longer, the air cooled, and the smell of earth rose fresh and clean. The robin flew away, a flash of red against the green. And then the gate opened. Archibald Craven stood in the doorway. He had returned because he had dreamed of the garden. Green light and a robin's song. He had woken with a name on his lips. He had come home. He saw the garden first. The green, the roses, the sunlight through the leaves. Then he saw Colin. His son was sitting on the grass, his face full of color, his eyes bright. He was not pale. He was not thin and afraid. He was smiling. "Father," Colin said. Archibald knelt beside his son. For a long moment, he did not speak. He simply looked at him, the life in his face, the color in his cheeks, the strength in his hands. "Colin," he said, and that was enough. They sat together as the evening gathered around them, father and son, the garden blooming in the soft, golden light. Mary sat a little apart, watching. Dickon stood by the gate, the robin on his shoulder. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The light faded slowly, the gold deepening to amber, the amber to rose, the rose to gray. The first stars appeared, faint and distant. One by one, they left the garden. Dickon went first, his footsteps light on the grass. Then Martha, who stood at the gate watching, a smile on her face. Then Ben Weatherstaff, who touched the wall with his weathered hand and nodded once. Archibald lifted Colin into his arms and carried him back to the house. Colin's head rested against his father's shoulder, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow. Mary was the last to leave. She stood at the door and looked back. The roses were pale in the twilight. The fountain was dark and quiet. The walls rose high on every side, covered in ivy. But the door was not hidden anymore. It would never be hidden again. She stepped through and closed it behind her. The house was warm and quiet. A fire burned in the library. The smell of wood smoke drifted through the corridors. The clock ticked softly. Mary climbed the stairs. Her feet were tired. Her hands were rough from the earth, but she felt light, as if something heavy had been lifted. She lay down on her bed. The window was open, and the night air drifted in, carrying the scent of damp earth and the first faint sweetness of the roses. She thought of the garden, and she was still. The world was quiet. The garden had settled into its long rest, the green dark and deep, the last bird silent, the first stars steady. The house had found its peace. The children had found their strength. The father had found his way home. There was nothing more to do. Nothing more to want. Nothing more to fear. Just the warm dark. Just the slow breath. Just the quiet pulse of the earth beneath everything, holding it all, asking nothing, giving everything. The door was closed. The garden would bloom again tomorrow. But tonight there was only this. Stillness. Quiet. Rest.